The night owl was a relic, a ribbon of aging steel and weary memories that stitched together the forgotten towns of the heartland. It was a train for those with more time than money, a vessel for the transient and the tired. On this particular Tuesday, as midnight painted the vast, empty plains in shades of ink and charcoal, the train was sparsely populated, a collection of solitary souls swaying in hypnotic unison with the rhythm of the tracks. Dr. Sarah Jenkins was one of those souls. Exhausted after a 3-day medical conference, she leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the featureless landscape blur into an impressionistic smear. She was a woman of science and logic, a resident in emergency medicine who found comfort in algorithms, diagnoses, and the predictable mechanics of the human body. The world, to her, was a complex but ultimately solvable puzzle. In the seat across the aisle, a young mother named Linda was trying to coax her 6-year-old son, Leo, to sleep. Leo, however, was wide-eyed, captivated by the dark world rushing past. He was a quiet, observant boy, clutching a worn teddy bear with one button for an eye. A few rows ahead, Ben Carter, a journalist with a cynical slouch and the rumpled look of a man who subsisted on coffee and skepticism, typed furiously on his laptop. He was chasing a deadline for a story about corporate malfeasance in the agricultural sector, story he was sure no one would read. The only other occupants of their car were a trio of college students returning from a hiking trip, their large backpacks cluttering the overhead racks, and an elderly woman knitting a scarf of impossible length, her needles clicking a soft, metallic counterpoint to the train's motion. The conductor, a man named Arthur, with a face like a weathered roadmap and a uniform that had seen decades of service, moved through the car with a slow, reassuring gait, his presence a symbol of order in the moving world. The first sign that something was amiss was subtle, easily dismissed. A flicker of the lights, a momentary shudder of the car that felt different from the usual jostling of the tracks. Sarah barely noticed, lost in her thoughts. Ben grunted in annoyance as his screen momentarily dimmed. Only little Leo saw it. He pressed his face against the window, his breath fogging the glass. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice small. "There's a man walking outside." Linda, half asleep, stroked his hair. "Don't be silly, sweetie. No one can walk outside a moving train. You're just seeing things." "He was funny," Leo insisted. "He had a red nose." Linda shushed him gently, pulling a blanket over his shoulders. "Go to sleep now." An hour crept by. The train plunged deeper into the night, a tiny, self-contained universe hurtling through an ocean of darkness. The college students were asleep, their heads lolling at awkward angles. The elderly woman's knitting had ceased, her hands resting in her lap. Ben had finally closed his laptop, his eyes heavy. Sarah was drifting in a state between wakefulness and sleep. It was a sound that jolted her fully awake. A single, high-pitched giggle that seemed to come from the end of the car, sharp and clear above the rhythmic clatter of the train. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated glee, yet it was utterly devoid of warmth. It was a sound that belonged in a funhouse, not in the hushed, sterile quiet of a midnight train. Sarah sat up, her senses on high alert. The car was empty save for the sleeping passengers. She looked at Ben, who had also heard it, his brow furrowed in confusion. He shrugged, a silent "What was that?" Arthur, the conductor, who had been in the small galley at the front of the car, emerged, his face etched with a professional concern. "Everything all right back here, folks?" Before anyone could answer, the door at the far end of the car slid open with a soft hiss. He stood framed in the doorway, a figure of such jarring, nightmarish incongruity that Sarah's logical mind struggled to process the image. He was a clown, not a cheerful party clown, but a grotesque caricature from a forgotten, decaying circus. His costume was a riot of faded, once vibrant silks in purple and green, stained and tattered at the cuffs. His face was a mask of cracked white grease paint, with two stark, black tears painted beneath one eye and a wide, blood-red smile that seemed carved into his features. A ruffled collar, yellowed with age, framed his face. He held a single, long-stemmed, black rose in one gloved hand. He didn't speak. He just stood there, swaying gently with the motion of the train. His painted smile a fixed rictus of malevolent cheer. His eyes, lost in the dark sockets of his makeup, seemed to drink in the scene, to savor the sudden, sharp intake of breath from the few who were awake. Ben, the journalist, recovered first, his skepticism a shield. "Lost your way to the circus, pal?" he called out, his voice laced with a nervous bravado. "Halloween's not for a few months." The clown's smile seemed to widen, if such a thing were possible. He took a slow, deliberate step into the car, his oversized shoes making no sound on the carpeted floor. He moved with a strange, fluid grace, a dancer's poise that was deeply unsettling in his clumsy-looking attire. He stopped beside Ben's seat, his head cocked to one side as if studying a curious insect. He extended the black rose in a gesture of offering. Ben stared at it, a smirk on his face, refusing to play along. "No thanks," Ben said. "I'm allergic." The clown giggled again, the same high, piercing sound. Then, with a flick of his wrist, the petals of the rose opened, and a fine, clear mist sprayed directly into Ben's face. Ben recoiled, sputtering and coughing, wiping at his eyes. "What the hell is that? Pepper spray?" He began to cough violently, his hands clawing at his throat. His face was turning a deep, mottled red. "I can't breathe," he gasped, his eyes wide with a terror that was no longer cynical. He slumped sideways in his seat, his body convulsing, a horrifying, gurgling sound coming from his lungs. Sarah, her medical training kicking in, leaped to her feet. "He's having an anaphylactic reaction. Someone help me get him on the floor." But before she could move, the clown had already passed by, continuing his silent, graceful promenade down the aisle. Arthur, the conductor, stood in his path, his hand outstretched. "That's enough," Arthur said, his voice a low, authoritative rumble. "I don't know what this is, but it's over. You're getting off at the next stop." The clown looked at the conductor's outstretched hand. He then raised his own, and in it was a deck of cards. With a flourish, he fanned them out. "Pick a card," he seemed to mouth, though no sound came out. Arthur stared, momentarily mesmerized by the strange, theatrical gesture. The clown's other hand moved with blurring speed. It was not a card he produced, but a long, wickedly thin blade that seemed to materialize from his silken sleeve. It looked like a stiletto, but it was flat and silver, like an oversized palette knife. He slid it with a surgeon's precision between Arthur's ribs. Arthur's eyes widened in shock. A dark stain spread across his crisp, white shirt. He looked down, his expression one of pure disbelief, then back at the clown's smiling face. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a wet, crimson bubble emerged. He crumpled to the floor, the deck of cards scattering around his still form. Panic erupted. The screams of the college students and the elderly woman shattered the night's silence. The chaos was a symphony for the clown. He stood over the conductor's body, his head tilted back as if in ecstasy, and let out a silent, shaking laugh. Sarah's mind was a maelstrom of terror and disbelief. This wasn't happening. This was a nightmare, a stress-induced hallucination. But the sight of the conductor's blood pooling on the floor, the sound of Ben's agonized wheezing, was terrifyingly real. Her training took over where her courage failed. "Everyone, get back! Move to the front of the car!" she yelled, her voice shaking but clear. She grabbed Linda, who was frozen in terror, and pulled her and a now sobbing Leo toward the galley. The elderly woman, surprisingly spry, was right behind them, her face a mask of pale horror. The three college students, 2 men and a woman, scrambled over their seats, their eyes wild with fear. They slammed the galley door shut, a flimsy barrier against the nightmare in the car. Sarah fumbled with the lock, her fingers slick with a cold sweat. "What's happening?" The female student, whose name was Jessica, stammered. "Who is he?" "He's a maniac." One of the male students, Mark, whispered, peering through the small window in the door. He's He's just standing there, smiling. Through the window they could see him. He wasn't trying to break down the door. He was putting on a show. He bent down and, with a delicate touch, plucked a single, brightly colored silk scarf from his pocket. He laid it over the conductor's face. Then he pulled, and another scarf came out, and another, and another. A never-ending chain of vibrant silks, piling up on the dead man's chest in a grotesque mockery of a magic trick. "We have to call for help," Sarah said, her voice strained. She looked around the small galley. A service phone was on the wall. She snatched it up. The line was dead. A crackle of static was the only reply. "The storm." The other male student, David, said, his voice trembling. "There was a storm warning. It must have knocked out the comms." They were trapped in a metal tube, hurtling through a dead zone, with a silent, theatrical killer who had just turned their world into his personal stage. Outside their flimsy door, the clown finished his trick. He took a theatrical bow to his sleeping and dead audience. Then he turned his head slowly. Her mind, accustomed to the structured chaos of an ER, was racing, trying to impose order on an insane situation. "He's one man. We are 6. We need to find a weapon, something to defend ourselves with." They ransacked the small space. The best they could come up with was a fire extinguisher, a metal coffee pot, and a handful of dull butter knives. It felt pathetic, a child's arsenal against a creature of pure nightmare. "We can't just stay in here," Mark argued, his jock-like confidence a thin veneer over his terror. "He'll find a way in. We need to move, get to the front of the train, to the engine room. Someone has to be driving this thing." The doors between the cars lock electronically. David, a lanky, studious-looking young man, countered. "The conductor has the master keycard. The conductor who is currently." His voice trailed off, the image of Arthur's body lying on the floor silencing him. For an hour they waited in a state of suspended terror. The silence from the other side of the door was, in many ways, more terrifying than an active assault. They could hear the steady, indifferent rhythm of the train, the occasional wheezing gasp from Ben, the journalist, who was still slumped in his seat, and the soft, muffled sobs of little Leo, who had buried his face in his mother's coat. Then, a new sound began. A soft, tinny, musical tune. It was a classic carousel waltz, the kind of cheerful, looping melody one would hear at a county fair. But on the dark, silent train, distorted and slightly off-key, it was the sound of madness. It was coming from a small speaker the clown had placed on a seat, a portable soundtrack for his one-man show. Under the cover of the unnerving music, he began to work. He wasn't trying to break down the door. He was disassembling it. They heard a soft scraping sound, and then the small, reinforced window in the door was pushed inward, falling to the floor with a dull thud. The clown had used his thin, palette knife blade to meticulously cut through the rubber sealant. A single, white-gloved hand appeared in the opening, waving cheerfully. Jessica screamed. Mark grabbed the fire extinguisher and blasted a thick, white cloud of CO2 through the opening. The hand retreated, but they could hear the clown's high-pitched, silent laughter. He was toying with them, turning their survival into a game. "We have to go. Now!" Sarah yelled. "There's a service hatch in the floor here. It leads to the undercarriage. It's a risk, but it's better than being sitting ducks." It was a desperate, insane plan. The hatch, normally used for maintenance access, opened onto a dark, windswept world of roaring steel and flying gravel. But it was their only way out of the sealed car. David and Mark, using their combined strength, managed to pry it open. One by one, they descended into the maelstrom, Linda clutching a terrified Leo to her chest. The undercarriage of the train was a treacherous, roaring hell. They had to cling to pipes and maintenance ladders, the wind threatening to tear them from their precarious perches, the noise of the wheels on the track a deafening, continuous thunder. They moved slowly, hand over hand, making their way toward the next car. Their goal, the service hatch they prayed would be there. They made it. Soaked, freezing, and trembling, they managed to pry open the hatch of the adjacent car and haul themselves inside. They had escaped. They found themselves in a sleeper car. The hallway was dark, the doors to the private compartments all closed. The air was still and silent, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just endured. For a moment, they allowed themselves a sliver of hope. They had outsmarted him. But the carousel music, faint but unmistakable, began to drift from the far end of the car. He wasn't in the car they had left. He was ahead of them. He had anticipated their move. The game was still on. "He's playing with us?" Jessica whispered, tears streaming down her face. He knew we'd run. They were now the rats in his maze. Their objective changed. It was no longer about getting to the engine room. It was about finding a place to hide, to wait him out. They began to check the doors of the sleeper compartments. Most were locked, occupied by sleeping passengers blissfully unaware of the horror unfolding around them. They found one that was unlocked. It was a small, two-bunk compartment, empty and dark. They all crowded inside, locking the door behind them, and collapsed into a terrified, shivering heap. "What does he want?" Linda sobbed quietly, stroking her son's hair. "This isn't random," Sarah said, her mind piecing together the theatricality of it all. The costume, the props, the music. He's performing. This is a stage for him. The carousel music grew louder, coming down the hallway, stopping right outside their door. A profound silence fell, broken only by the sound of their own frantic heartbeats. Then, a slip of paper was pushed under the door. David, his hand trembling, picked it up. It was a playing card. The Joker. On the back, written in a childish, looping scrawl, were the words, "Knock, knock." A soft, rhythmic tapping began on the door. "Knock, knock, knock." Mark, his fear finally boiling over into a rage, lost it. "I'm not dying in this box," he roared. He grabbed the heavy fire extinguisher. "When I open the door, we rush him. All of us. He's just one man." Ignoring Sarah's pleas to wait, to think, he wrenched the door open and charged into the hallway, screaming a defiant war cry. The clown was waiting. He wasn't holding a knife or a weapon. He was holding a large, brightly colored hoop, like a circus performer. As Mark charged, the clown simply held the hoop up, and Mark, in his blind rage, ran straight through it. The other side of the hoop, however, was not empty. With a final, graceful flick, the clown snapped the hoop shut. It was not a simple hoop. It was a ring of sharpened, inward-facing steel blades, a monstrous, medieval-looking device disguised as a toy. It closed around Mark's waist, severing him in two. His upper torso fell to the floor with a wet, heavy thud. His scream cut short in a gurgle of blood. The survivors who witnessed it were paralyzed by the sheer, inventive brutality of the act. The clown, his white face now splattered with a spray of crimson, simply dropped the bloody device and took a small, elegant bow. David, in a fit of pure, unthinking terror, turned and ran in the opposite direction, down the hallway towards the back of the train. The clown watched him go, making no move to pursue. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a yo-yo. It was a simple, old-fashioned wooden toy. He let it drop and it spun at the end of its string. But as it spun, a thin, almost invisible monofilament wire unspooled from it, stretching taut across the hallway at ankle height. David, running blindly, never saw it. His feet hit the wire, and he was thrown violently forward, his head striking the sharp metal corner of a door frame with a sickening crack. He lay still, his neck bent at an impossible angle. 2 down in less than 10 seconds. The clown's gaze then fell on Sarah, Jessica, and Linda, who were still huddled in the doorway of the compartment. He began to walk towards them, his movements slow, savoring their terror. From another pocket, he produced 3 juggling balls. He began to juggle them with an expert's casual grace, the balls a blur of color in the dim light. But as they arced through the air, Sarah noticed something glinting on their surface. They weren't simple balls. They were covered in small, razor-sharp shards of glass. This time, Sarah reacted. She shoved Jessica and Linda back into the compartment and slammed the door, fumbling with the lock just as the first ball shattered against the wood, embedding a spray of glass shards where her head had just been. They were trapped again. But this time they had seen the full extent of his monstrous creativity. He wasn't just a killer, he was an artist, and his medium was death. It was little Leo who provided their next, desperate move. "The window," he whispered, pointing a small, trembling finger. The compartment had a large window. It didn't open, but it was their only other way out. Using the last of their adrenaline-fueled strength, Sarah and Jessica grabbed a small metal stool and began to hammer at the reinforced glass. It took a dozen blows, but it finally spiderwebbed, and then shattered, the sound of it lost in the roar of the train. Cold, biting wind filled the small room. They were on the side of the train, with nothing but a narrow maintenance ledge and a 1,000-foot drop to the dark plains below. It was suicide, but staying was a death sentence. Sarah went first, her feet finding a precarious hold on the ledge. She helped Linda, who was clutching Leo, out onto the ledge. Jessica followed, her body pressed flat against the cold steel of the train. They began to inch their way along the outside of the speeding train, the wind tearing at them, their fingers numb and raw. Behind them, they heard the sound of their compartment door being splintered from its hinges. They didn't look back. They just clung to the side of the metal beast, for terrified souls suspended between a killer and the abyss. The insane, cheerful notes of the carousel music, a farewell lullaby from the funhouse of fear. The outside of the night owl was a maelstrom of wind, noise, and sheer vertigo-inducing terror. The 4 remaining survivors, Sarah, Linda, little Leo, and Jessica, clung to the narrow maintenance ledge, their bodies pressed against the cold, vibrating steel of the carriage. Every gust of wind was a physical blow, threatening to peel them from their precarious handholds and send them hurtling into the black, rushing void below. The roar of the wheels on the track was a physical presence, a deafening, all-consuming sound that vibrated through their bones. Sarah led the way, her mind a laser focus of pure survival instinct. All her medical knowledge, her understanding of the world's orderly systems, had been rendered useless. Here, there was only the next handhold, the next careful shift of weight. They moved with agonizing slowness, inching their way toward the front of the train, car by car. They passed the windows of other sleeper compartments, catching fleeting glimpses of sleeping passengers, oblivious to the life-or-death drama unfolding just inches from their heads. The sight was surreal, a reminder of a normal world that no longer seemed to exist. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the space between the sleeper car and the next car ahead, the dining car. The connecting bellows, a flexible, accordion-like tunnel, offered a brief, precious respite from the punishing wind. More importantly, the exterior door to the dining car was a simpler, older model with a manual latch. It was frozen with rust and ice, but after a desperate, collective effort, they managed to wrench it open and tumble inside. The dining car was a ghost town. Tables were set with white linen cloths and gleaming silverware, ready for a breakfast that now seemed an impossible, distant dream. The silence in the car was a blessing, a balm on their raw, overstimulated senses. They collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling with cold and adrenaline. "Did we lose him?" Jessica whispered, her voice hoarse. "I don't know," Sarah replied, scanning the empty car. "But we can't stay here. We have to keep moving. We have to get to the engine room and stop this train." It was as she spoke that she saw it. On the pristine white tablecloth of the centermost table, a single object had been placed. It was a child's jack-in-the-box. It was old, its painted wooden surface chipped, depicting scenes of a cheerful, long-forgotten circus. Leo, his childish curiosity momentarily overriding his fear, pointed at it. "It's a toy," he said softly. A cold dread washed over Sarah. "Don't touch it," she commanded, her voice sharp. The lid of the box creaked open a fraction of an inch. The soft, tinny melody of "Pop Goes the Weasel" began to play, each note a crystal drop of dread in the silent car. They were frozen, mesmerized by the terrible, inevitable countdown of the song. As the final notes played, They braced themselves for the clown to pop out. Instead, the lid flew open, and a thick, yellowish gas billowed out, rapidly filling the car. It was not a toy. It was a bomb. "Get down! Cover your mouths!" Sarah screamed, recognizing the sickly sweet smell of chloroform. They dropped to the floor, crawling frantically toward the front of the car, but the gas was heavy and fast. Sarah's vision began to swim, the edges of the world turning dark and fuzzy. The last thing she saw before consciousness slipped away was Linda pulling Leo under a table, trying to shield him with her own body. Sarah awoke to a sensation of gentle rocking and the smell of grease paint and decay. Her head throbbed. She was no longer in the dining car. She was in the luggage car, a vast, dark space filled with a chaotic landscape of suitcases and cargo crates. She was tied to a chair, her wrists and ankles bound tight with what felt like brightly colored balloon strings. Jessica, Linda, and Leo were there, too, similarly bound, just beginning to stir. And in the center of the car, illuminated by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, was a small, makeshift stage. The clown was there. He was sitting at a small, cluttered vanity table, looking into a cracked mirror. For the first time, they saw him without his bright, curly wig. His head was bald, his scalp pale and scarred. He was meticulously reapplying his white grease paint, his movements practiced and ritualistic. The carousel music was playing again, softly, from a small, battered gramophone. He was preparing for his final act. When he finished with his makeup, he stood and turned to face them. He was holding a ventriloquist's dummy. It was a horrifying thing, a miniature version of the clown himself, with the same painted smile and dead, glass eyes. "And now for the grand finale," the clown's voice boomed, but his lips did not move. The voice came from the dummy, a high-pitched, gravelly sound, amplified by the acoustics of the metal car. "Our lovely volunteers will assist me in a classic feat of escapology, the disappearing act." He giggled, the sound rattling through the dummy's wooden mouth, as he produced a long, glittering saw. It was this final, insane piece of theater that broke something in Sarah. The logic, the fear, the desperation coalesced into a single white-hot point of pure, defiant rage. She was not going to be a prop in this monster's final performance. She began to struggle against her bonds, not with panicked thrashing, but with a focused, analytical intensity. She was a doctor. She knew anatomy. She twisted her wrists, feeling for the point of greatest pressure, the angle at which she could create the most slack. The balloon strings were surprisingly strong, but they had a slight elasticity. She worked, ignoring the burning pain as the strings cut into her skin. The clown, distracted by his monologue, was setting up his act, positioning a large, wooden crate next to a terrified Jessica. He was explaining to his dummy how the trick would work, his back to Sarah. One of her hands came free. With a surge of adrenaline, she worked on the other, then her ankles. She was free. Silently, she slipped from the chair. She scanned the dark, cluttered car, her eyes searching for a weapon. She saw it. Propped against a stack of crates was a long, heavy steel bar, part of a broken cargo restraint. She grabbed it, the cold, heavy steel a comforting, solid weight in her hands. The clown was still monologuing. "The key to any great magic trick," the dummy's voice rasped, "is misdirection." "You're right," Sarah said, her voice clear and cold, ringing through the cavernous space. The clown spun around, his painted smile faltering for the first time, a flicker of genuine surprise in his dark eyes. Sarah didn't hesitate. She ran at him, swinging the heavy steel bar like a baseball bat. She aimed not for his head, but for his knee. The bar connected with a sickening, wet crunch. The clown shrieked, a raw, human sound of pure agony that came from his own throat, not the dummy's. He collapsed to the floor, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. He looked up at her, the performer's mask shattered, replaced by a face of pure, animalistic hatred. He lunged for her from the floor, his hands like claws. But Sarah was ready. She brought the bar down again, a heavy, final blow to his head. The sound was a dull, hollow thud. He lay still. The painted smile was still there, a grotesque, final irony on his now lifeless face. The silence that followed was absolute, the only sound the steady, indifferent rhythm of the train. It was over. Sarah, her body trembling with the aftermath of the fight, rushed to free the others. They huddled together for a long moment, a small, broken family of survivors, amidst the strange, pathetic props of the clown's final stage. They made their way, finally, to the front of the train. The engine room was empty. A complex system of levers and gauges kept the train running on a pre-programmed course. In the driver's seat, they found the engineer and his co-pilot, both dead for hours, killed before the clown had even begun his performance in the passenger cars. They had been the opening act. Using the emergency radio, which was miraculously still functional in the engine's shielded cab, Sarah called for help. She told the dispatcher their location, what had happened, and that they had stopped the threat. As the sun began to rise, casting a weak, gray light over the plains, the night owl finally slowed to a stop. In the distance, they could see the flashing red and blue lights of dozens of police cars and ambulances, a sign that the real world still existed, that their long night was finally over. As they were being led from the train, wrapped in blankets, a detective asked Sarah about the clown. Did he say anything? Why he did it? Sarah thought for a moment, remembering the vanity table, the cracked mirror, the scarred scalp. And she remembered one other detail, a small, faded newspaper clipping tucked into the corner of the mirror frame. It was an old article dated 50 years ago. The headline read, "Tragic fire engulfs Cirque du Chagrin. Dozens of performers, including famed clown Giggles, presumed dead." The location of the tragedy was a small, forgotten town, a town the night owl had passed through at the stroke of midnight. "No," Sarah said, her voice a weary whisper. "He didn't say a thing. He just wanted to put on a show." She knew some things had no logical explanation. Some puzzles were not meant to be solved. Some ghosts, born of tragedy, were just destined to ride the rails forever, searching for a final, captive audience on the midnight train.